Today we're going through the Silmarillion, chapter 17 of The Coming of Men into the West. If you're new here, welcome to Art of a Halfling, where we talk about Lord of the Rings and a little bit about D&D, so let's get to it. So this chapter begins. It's 300 years since the Noldor have entered into Silmarillion. We are now in the days of long peace, and Finrod Felagund goes east of the Silmarillion with sons of Fëanor, Maglor, and Madros, and they go off hunting. But Finrod Felagund sees the shining of the mountains of Ered Lindon and desires to go off on his own for a bit. So he travels towards Ered Lindon, and there he sees something unusual. He sees the flickering of lights, which is unusual because he is in the land of Osirion, and here the green elves do not light flames. And now he hears singing, which isn't too unusual. He is near Ered Lindon, which is singing, but this is of a different language. It's not of Sindarin, it's not Dwarvish, it's not even Orcish. So Finrod's curiosity gets the best of him, and he wanders closer to the lights and the singing. And there he is in awe and amazement at what he sees. Men. It is an encampment of men newly traveled over the mountains. And so Finrod stays low for a time and just watches them until night comes and they all fall asleep. And now Finrod wanders closer into the encampment and sees a very crudely made harp. He picks it up and he begins to play it and sing this most beautiful song of the creation of Arda, of the Valar of Valinor, the trees of Valinor. And he sings this most beautiful song. And the men begin to slowly awake, each believing that this is but a dream, but in seeing that other men are awake, realize this is real. And though they cannot understand the words of Felagund, they are given the vision of the song and according to their own understanding. And at first, the men believe that Finrod is a Valar, one that they have heard rumors of. But in time, Finrod Felagund is able to slowly understand what these men are saying, and the men begin to love Finrod and become very loyal to Finrod and the House of Finarfin. And the men name Finrod Gnome, meaning wisdom, and his people Gnomen, the wise. And because the men were in the east, they did have some encounters with dark elves, and their language holds some similarity to the Quindi, which all has the same origin. And in this, Finrod is able to begin to communicate with men, and he communicates the most with Bjor, their leader. Their chieftain of the group. Now, Bjor spoke very little of the awakening of men, and he says that they have traveled west to get away from the darkness, and that the darkness they leave behind in both physically and in memory. And he tells Finrod very little of what has occurred. But the elves and the Eldar do sort of piece together that the men might have been affected by Morgoth himself, that Morgoth possibly had spies in the land and received word of the awakening of men in Hildorian and snuck away from Angband to go and see if he could manipulate the men. And the desire would be to bring men west so that they could fight against the elves. But in seeing that men were so few and the Eldar at the time were growing in union and in strength, Morgoth left them and returned to Angband. But he did not leave without a trace of doom among the men, in the same way that there's doom among the Noldor. So Bjor tells Finrod that there are other groups of men journeying west, that there is a group by the name of the Halden, And while their language is different, they are still waiting on the other side of the mountains to get the all clear from Bjor. And there is a larger group led by Marak that was journeying west first, but because they are a larger group, it's taking them longer to go east or to go west. Now, the green elves of Silmarillion do not like men. And in seeing that Finrod Felagund has this loyalty with men, they ask him to tell the men to go back from where they came from, or at least leave their land. Men are eating the animals, they're cutting down trees, all things that the elves are against. And so Finrod goes to Bjor and advises them to take his people north. And in this, Bjor listens, and they cross over the river Gelion into the land of Amrad and Amras, and they create an encampment here, a city here, and they name it Estolad. And after a year, Felagund decides it's time for him to go back to Nargothrond, and Bjor begs to go with him. He wants to stay in the service of Finrod, and in this, Bjor actually gets his name Bjor, and that before his name was Balon. And so Bjor goes with Finrod to Nargothrond and is never to return to Estolad. He remains with Finrod. Now Bjor leaves in command his son Baran. Now soon the people of Haldun cross over, and they quickly realize that the Green Elves don't like them, and they decide to go north to Thargelion, and here they remain for a time in the land of Caranthir, who pays them no attention, and they're very content with where they're at for a while. So a year later, the people of Marak cross over, and these people are described as being very warlike, very orderly, and the Green Elves do not like them at all. They're quite frightened. They keep themselves hidden. And the people of Marak choose to continue west towards Estolad and the people of Baran, and they dwell just south of Estolad, and here they remain close friends with the people of Estolad for some time. Now, Felagund and other elves are very intrigued and curious about men, and so they often come to Estolad to see men. And Fingolfin sends a messenger welcoming the men into Beleriand. And at this point, in Valinor, men were called Atani, but by the orders of Thingol, the language of Valinor is no longer to be used in Beleriand, and so a new name was given to men, Edain. And so many young men or Edain go into the service of kings and lords of the Eldar, including Malak, son of Marak, and he lives in Hithlum for 14 years and learns Sindarin and is given a new name, Aradan. And men soon grow discontent in where they're at in Estolad, and they have a desire to continue to go west. However, they don't know the way. They don't know where they're going. They know the direction, but that's kind of it. And the kings of the three houses of the Noldor see the strength in men and invite any that want to live with them and with them and their people. So we get the beginning of the migration of the Edain, and at first it's only a few here and there that kind of go into the service of the Eldar, but after 50 years it says that thousands have gone and traveled and gone into services of the Noldor, and most would travel far north to travel until eventually they learned better routes. So the people of Bjor lived in the lands under the house of Finarfin, and the people of Ardan, because Marak never left Estolad, went west, with some living in Hithlum. And Magor, son of Ardan, and many others lived in the southern region of Ered Wethrin. So Felagund is the only one of the Eldar to actually go to Thingol and kind of talk to him about men and about Edain. And Thingol, no surprise, doesn't like men being here. He doesn't like the idea of men trying to come and take over land. And since the coming of men over into Beleriand, he's been getting weird dreams, and so he's very hesitant and reluctant about men entering into land. And he says that men are not allowed to take any of the land in the north, and that if they do reside under the services of the princes of the Noldor, then the princes of the Noldor are to be held accountable for anything that the men do, and that by no means will any man ever enter into Doriath. So Melian doesn't really say much to Thingol at this point. She's just kind of like, okay. But it says that she kind of goes off to Galadriel and goes, well, you know, there's going to be one man that does make it into Doriath. My girdle won't be able to hold off the evil that brings him. And yeah, there's going to be lots of songs about him that will last the changing of Middle-earth. And so that's all that's said about that. And so many men stay in Estolad for a time, either because they're too old or too scared of elves. And it says that few would remain until the ruin of Beleriand, and then they would end up fleeing east. So now there is a division among men on whether to stay or go back eastwards, you know, to get away. And Beric of Bjor and Amlak, grandson of Marak, both say they have come to the west to find the light. The light is over the sea, and they aren't able to get there. They're not able to live in the bliss of the gods, except for one god, the Dark Lord. And it's because of him that they've escaped west to get away from his pain and death, now to just be in his presence again. They're like, we're not going to go further north to get closer to him. So a meeting is held between elves and men, with elves responding to Beric saying, like, there's nowhere you can go to escape Morgoth. And that the Eldar have, like, their purpose has most likely been to either kill Morgoth or to at least keep him at bay. So Beric says, like, okay, well, good luck with that. Don't expect us to do anything. Like, our lives are already short as it is without going and getting ourselves killed. So now someone that looks like Amlak stands up and basically says, like, how do we know the Dark Lord is real? How do we know he's not just something made up by the Eldar to keep us under their thumb? Like, there's no evidence of him being real, so maybe the Eldar just want the land of their own. I say, you know, let the orcs have their land, let the elves have their land, and let us have our land. You know, just let us be, let us live our lives. So this kind of leaves everybody a little unsettled, because they're like, what if that's true? What if the Dark Lord is fake? Like, what if he's not real? Because keep in mind, like, 300 years have gone by since the awakening of men, which is possibly when Morgoth actually, like, intervened with them at all. So you're looking at 15, 16, 17 generations that have passed without any, like, actual evidence of Morgoth, just passing of stories. So a lot of these people are like, what if he's right? What if this is all fake? And then at this point, Amlak actually returns from wherever and says, I was never at that meeting. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, this scares the bejeebers out of everybody. And the elves are like, looky there, he's not fake. Like, that's proof for ya. And so now the men are kind of worried. So Bereg leads thousands of the people of Bjor from Estolad southwards. And the people of Amlak, who chose to have a different leader, they didn't want to follow Amlak anymore, ended up going with Bereg's group and either going south or leaving east, both being lost to history. Amlak, however, goes in the service under Madros because now he's like, if you're going to take my identity, we've got some beef we got to settle. So he stays. So now during all of this, you have the Halidin that are still in Thargelion. They're content. They're living their lives. Well, Morgoth, now realizing that he can't really divide elves and men in the way that he intended, is like, well, I'm just going to hurt you in any way I can hurt you. So he sends an orc raid to the Halidin group. Now, Halidin are under their own control and command. They don't really serve any of the lords, and they kind of do their own thing. But it says that, like, each a homestead is sort of governing themselves. And so when they do get attacked, they're very slow to unite. So the orcs, mind you, this whole land is pretty well guarded by the Noldor to keep orcs away. But the orcs are very stealthy in how they come over. So they go over Ered Lindon, they cross the Dwarf Road, and basically come south of the woods of Caranthir into the people of Halidin. And in this way are able to attack them. Well, because the people are very slow to get together, it's a little hard for them to defend themselves. But one man named Haldad does is able to gather their strongest and bravest men, and he gathers up the people and he takes them to an angled land between the river Asgard and the river Gelion, and here creates a stockade from river to river, puts all the women and children on the other side to kind of defend themselves, to kind of like keep themselves besieged, I guess, with only their, to last there as long as their food does. Now, Hadad had twins. He had a son named Haldar and a daughter named Haleth, and both are described as being very valiant in their defense against the orcs, and with Haleth being of great heart and strength. Now, Haldad is actually killed in the fight against the orcs, and in an attempt to save his father, Haldar is also killed by the orcs. So now we just have Haleth left in command. And everybody is beginning to lose hope and are kind of held up for about 7 days in this mess. And at this point, the orcs have now broken through the stockade and everybody's just trying to survive. And now they hear this loud trumpeting sound. And here we have Caranthir and his host coming in to save the day. He drives off all of the orcs. And in seeing the men and how they, did hold up, he has more of a fondness and kindness towards men, and particularly he has great honor for Haleth. He really admires the strength that she had in all of this, and he tells her like, hey, if you want, you can move up a little further north and you'll have your own land, but you'll be under the protection of the Eldar. Haleth is like, I don't really want to be under anybody's control, and most of her people are the same mind. They don't want to be under anyone's control or anything like that. So she's like, no, we're going to go ahead and go west towards Estolad. And so she does. She gathers her people. She goes towards Estolad, where they remain for some time, but they are still kept separate from everybody there. They're still kind of their own unit. And here, the people make Haleth their commander, their chief, and are now called the people of Haleth. And it says that Haleth never wed. She remained chief until the end of her days, in which case she gave the command over to her nephew Haldan. And it says that the people of Haleth remain in Estolad for a time, but eventually she had a desire to go west. All of the men have this continuing desire to continue westward. And so a lot of the people, though, were actually against this idea of moving west. They were just like, let us just live our lives. Let us just be content with where we're at. But Haleth is like, no, we're moving west. This is what I want. And so she decides to lead her people through the valley of Ered Gorgrath, without any aid from the Eldar, without any guidance or anything like that. And the book does say that this land isn't as dangerous as it will be, but it's still dangerous enough where mortal men should not be passing through without the aid of the Eldar. But Haleth does anyways, and she guides her people through it with a lot of loss, a lot of heartache, and basically the only way they get through is through her own sheer will that pulls them through this. Until finally, her people cross over the Brithiac, and many regret ever taking this journey. And so some are regretting the journey. They're like, we can't turn back. You know what? We're just going to take up land here and just try and get back to some normalcy. So some live in the woods of Talith Dirnin, with some still wandering further west to Nargothrond. But many still loved the Lady Haleth and chose to stay with her, and so she led them to the forest of Brethil. And it says that many of the scattered folk would actually return to Brethil when evil days were to come. Now, this land technically belonged to Thingol. While it wasn't under the girdle of Melion, it was still Thingol's land. And he was real like, I'm going to kick her out of this land. I don't want men here. But Finrod Felagund comes to her defense and tells Thingol, like, this is all that she's been through. Just let her stay there. And Thingol's like, okay, fine, she can stay there, but her people have to guard the crossing of Tieglin. And Haleth is just like, do you see my father? Do you see my brother? Do you know what all I've been through? Do you honestly think that I would befriend the creatures that killed my kin? And if this is the way that the Eldar think, then men will never understand you. And so basically she's like, well, yeah, duh, I'm gonna guard this. Like, that's a stupid thing for you to ask me to do. And so it says that Halith lives in Brethil for the rest of her days. And when she does die, the people raise a green mound over her, and it's called Tuath Haritha, or the Lady Borrow, or Hardin and Arwen in Sindarin. So this is how men sort of began to live in Beleriand. And soon the Edain men learned Sindar, and it kind of became their common language because they wanted to be able to speak with elves, and they also wanted to know more of the lore of elves. But after some time, the Eldar realized that men really needed to be their own governors. Like, to have everybody intermingled in the way that they were wasn't a good idea. And so eventually men were appointed as chief, and while the alliance between men and elves still remained strong, men followed their own leaders and marched under their own commanders. However, it does say that many young men would still be in the service of the Eldar kings for a time. Now it says that the greatest chief of men was Hador Lorindol, who was the great-grandson of Malak. And Hador served under King Fingolfin and gained the king's love to the point where the king actually gave him lordship over Dorlomion. And here Hador gathered his men up and, created his own community. And Hador, it says in his home, would only speak Sindarin, but they never forgot their own language, and in this it would become the language of the Numenor. In Dorthronian, the command was given over to the people of Bjor, and in Ladros, it was given to Boromir, grandson of Bjor. So there's a paragraph just about the genealogy, but basically from Boromir would come the kings of Numenor. So all of the men, because they followed so closely with the Noldor, they did fall under the doom of Noldor. However, men still did great deeds under the kings, and the Eldar remembered them for a long time. And the strength of men was added to the Noldor, and Morgoth was actually kept in Angband, kind of kept away partially because the people of Hador were hardy and fearless people. They weren't affected by the cold and would often travel north to keep a watch on Angband and anything that was occurring in there. So men now are thriving and growing, with the greatest of the men being Hador Goldenhead, and his people were described as strong, ready in mind, bold, and mighty among the children of Luvatar and the youth of mankind. So the house of Hador were blonde and blue-eyed, except for Turin, whose mother was of the house of Bjor. And these people, it says that they were quick to anger and laughter, and which made me think, like, I bet Tolkien would really enjoy this house. But the house of Bjor is described as being of dark or brown hair with gray eyes, and much more in likeness to the Noldor, and were more loved by the Noldor because they were more eager to learn, they were craftier, and they had long memory, and they were also moved to pity quicker than laughter. So they were very solemn people. And the people of Halith were very much like the house of Bjor, but of smaller stature, and they weren't that interested in lore. And in fact, many of these people preferred their solitude. They didn't really like to be around a bunch of people. They spoke very little, and they would often wander the woods. And it says that while their time in the West was brief, it was also very unhappy. So, however, moving on, the lives of men were longer in Beleriand, and men in the West learned a lot more. They grew wiser, more skillful than those that had remained in the East. Now Bjor finally dies at the age of 93 years old, serving 44 of his years under the house of Finrod Felagund. And Bjor simply dies of old age. There's no ailment, there's no wound, there's nothing. He died peacefully in old age. And at this moment is when the Eldar really grasp the concept of man's swift life and their mortality. And they begin to wonder, like, what exactly happens to men when they die? And now they begin to really feel the grief and loss of their friends. So that's this chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I did. This was a lot of information, and it was a little hard to get through at the beginning, but learning about Haleth, like, anybody who says that Tolkien didn't write a lot of women or a lot of strong women has not really read into the lore, because he's written quite a few women, and Haleth is now someone who, another female, who has just gone through the Valley of Ered Gorgoroth and got through by sheer will. Like, that's impressive, in my opinion. And she was someone that was well revered among her own people and among other Eldar. So I think that's really cool to have this strong female character. So anybody that tells you that there's not strong women in Middle Earth are wrong, because there are. And Haleth is one of them. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this chapter, and finally getting men into the mix. Again, I'm kind of like a little disappointed in the Valar for not sort of stepping up to the plate, but I guess they felt like, well, we're supposed to prepare the land, we prepared it, there's your sun and moon. That's all we had to do, until they're kind of leaving everybody to their own means, I guess. So that's disappointing. But now we have men, and yeah, we're gonna start getting into some of the bigger stories and chunks and things, and it's gonna be exciting. So I hope you guys stick around to hear more of what happens with men in the Noldor, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and may your homes be filled with food and cheer. Bye.